So when you're scoring for a film, there's one question you have to ask yourself. What makes this sound like blank? How do I make something sound like a pirate? How do I make something sound like it's flying? What is the sound of something that's suspenseful? How do I take danger and put that into a theme? And to be honest, each one of those questions is an entire field of study into itself. Just trying to answer why a piece of music can elicit a certain response in a certain group of people can get its own library of dissertations trying to answer that question, let alone just a brief answer on the internet. But there is one secret to film scoring that's been lost to history that I think a lot of people overlook when it comes to asking why something sounds the way it does, at least when it comes to scoring a film or a TV show or even a video game. And believe it or not, that mysterious secret comes from the era of silent film. Now I know what you're thinking, and no, I have not lost my mind yet, but the silent film era is a treasure trove of undiscovered scoring gems for a few very specific reasons. And I feel like you don't ever really see people talking about it online. So first off, yes, they're called silent films because they were silent, but as many people online will tell you, in practice, they were far from quiet. Chances are that if you've ever listened to a silent film or seen a clip of a silent film, then you've probably heard something like this. This is the Maple Leaf Rag, the most famous piece of music ever written by a guy called Scott Joplin, and it's a piece of ragtime music. Ragtime was a genre of music that was extraordinarily popular during the turn of the century. You have most likely heard ragtime at some point in your life, and it's widely associated with Scott Joplin, America's first big composer. Sure, there are a lot of other American composers in the history books. As a piano player myself, Gottschalk comes to mind, but Scott Joplin is the first American composer that gets mentioned alongside the greats like Beethoven and Mozart. He was phenomenal, and he gave us those famous pieces like the Maple Leaf Rag, or you might have heard The Entertainer, which was popularized by the 1973 film The Sting. Now, Maple Leaf Rag came out in 1899, and the silent film craze was from the mid-1890s through to 1927. So you can see how ragtime was gaining popularity just in time for silent films to come to the scene. So if you want to invoke that 19-teen sound, then some ragtime over some silent film is really going to set the mood. But it's not just a nostalgia thing. There's a good chance that you'd actually hear some ragtime if you went to see a silent film in the movie theater during that time period. Because, and it's not really that much of a secret, everyone on the internet talks about this, but silent films weren't silent. From the very first public showings, they were accompanied by some kind of live music. Initially, you might hear someone just playing an instrument in the room with no concern for what's going on the screen, kind of like when you have a live piano player at a fancy restaurant. But naturally, with time, musicians started paying attention to the screen and began improvising certain lines that would better fit the tone of the film. And right off the bat, you can see some concern with that if you're a director or a studio exec. If every performance is improvised, then every performance is different. Each one will rely on the expertise and experience of that specific performer. Maybe in the mornings, the theater hires a parlor performer who knows nothing but ragtime, and you have a film that's filled with ragtime, but in the evenings, they hire the church organist, and all you get are references to hymns and the classic music that they teach on the side. What's more is that it wasn't always just a single performer accompanying the film. In larger theaters, you could have up to and including a full orchestra led by a conductor and the whole 9 yards. And in some bizarre circles, you had instruments that were specifically designed to try and accompany films, like this monstrosity, the Photoplayer. So screenings of films tended to vary drastically in the music depending on where you were. But even then, that kind of raises more questions like, for example, if you're using a full symphony orchestra, how do you get a whole orchestra to improvise together? Initially, the conductors had to put together medleys of classical music, just lists of whatever classical music they were going to play during various scenes that they thought would fit well. And this is where things get interesting, because you can find books of people listing pieces of music and what they thought they sounded like, and what scenes they thought would work best with that music. Like here's a book by Arnaud Rapé called Motion Picture Moods, published in 1924. Links to the scans of this book are in the description below. But the way that you use this book is that you look up the subject of your scene and then it suggests what music he thinks would work best with that kind of scene. So say that this scene has an airplane in it, and wow, that's a really interesting way to spell airplane. But say your film has an airplane scene. Well, Rapé recommends that you use either Rondo Capriccioso or Scherzo by Mendelssohn. And if you go to that page, you can see the excerpt from the piece that he thinks best fits with that scene, as well as a list of other potential subjects for scenes and their corresponding page numbers, all down the side of the page to help you quickly navigate through the book as the scenes change and you need to get to new music. And this is, in effect, why studying silent film scores is so useful. These books show you exactly how certain themes were perceived by the audience of the time. This is literally in black and white what they thought certain pieces sounded like and where and how they would have used them on the big screen. And some of these should stand out to you. For example, Rapé suggests that if you have a scene during a storm or at sea, that you should use Griegs in the Hall of the Mountain King. For a wedding, right at the top of the wedding list, it's the Wedding March by Mendelssohn. For a funeral scene, use the Funeral March by Chopin. Arguably, this is why certain pieces of music sound the way that they do to us. This is pretty much where they decided that a funeral was going to sound more like Chopin as opposed to somebody else like maybe Beethoven, or that a storm was going to sound more like Grieg instead of Mozart. So, and diehard fans are going to know what I'm going to say here, this is technically a book of leitmotifs. These are leitmotifs, or pieces of music that represent a person, place, or thing in a story. So when the airplane comes, this is our airplane theme, or leitmotif, or whatever you want to call it. And even when it came to completely improvising a score, it would have been much easier to come up with themes for the various characters and events in the film. That way you weren't constantly having to come up with new music that would fit the tone of the scene for the entire film. But going back to our book here, if you ever happen to be thinking, I wonder how I would make something sound like a doll, well, here's a good place to start. Maybe you want to know something that would sound good in the background of a coffee shop while there's a bunch of people talking. Well, here's a suggestion for something to play during chatter. But wait, there's more. In 1925, Rapé one-upped himself by releasing an encyclopedia of music for pictures. Just like his last book, it's a collection of scenes with recommendations of what music would sound best in those scenes. And it was definitely written in the 20s. Yikes. But maybe you're looking for something that might sound like skeletons. Well, here's the Danse Macabre. But unlike his other book that was completely arranged for piano, or I guess organ, this one doesn't have any music in it whatsoever. He relies on the fact that you already have access to all this music from your own personal library, because it was the 20s, and that's kind of how being a musician worked back then. But what's more interesting is that it leaves lines for you to add in the encyclopedia as you find more pieces of music that you feel fit better in a certain scene. Meaning that if any of you find this book out there, there's a chance that some musician somewhere added their own flair to this book, which is really cool, and if you find any, let me know. And again, links of the scans to these books in the description, and a massive shout out to the Silent Film Sound and Music Archive for putting these up on the internet. But after collections and encyclopedias like this, ambitious composers out there wondered if there was a way to actually score for silent film. What if you wanted to give a film its own original sound? What would be a way of putting your own music into a film that wasn't necessarily improvising, but also wasn't just a collection of classical music or other popular music? How would you do that? Well, some enterprising composers decided to write their own catalogs of incidental music that they thought would work during specific scenes. And with that was the birth of something called photoplay music. Now, photoplay music is music written to accompany silent films. For example, here's a collection by Stepan Zamecnik in 4 volumes that I was able to find online. So here in volume 1, if you wanted some music for a funeral, here you go. And it sounds absolutely nothing like that Chopin example. But if audiences had been listening to Chopin during funeral scenes of their films, then something that sounded very similar to that would have worked for those audiences. And on top of that, if your film has a funeral scene, then chances are it also has a scene where somebody dies. And right under our funeral march, on the same page, we have a score for our death scene. But really, it was techniques like photoplay music that solidified certain musical tropes and techniques that we know to this day. For example, in the book The Remick Folio of Moving Picture Music Volume 1 by Jens Bodewalt Lamp, we have the first ever appearance of Misterioso Pizzicato. And with the popularity of these original collections of music, Hollywood started producing their own versions, except they would be specifically composed for a specific film in mind, with the action on screen governing what music would be played when. And this was called a cue sheet. Here's an example from Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. You can see how and when the musician was instructed to move from one cue to the next. So when you see the man buying a box of candy, you switch to this piece of music here, and so on and so forth for the rest of the film. So a cue sheet is basically a fragmented score with specific instructions as to when you're supposed to play what music depending on what's happening on the screen. And the advantage of using a cue sheet was that it basically gave film studios as much control as they could have for the time over what music was playing where. That is, if the musicians decided to use those cue sheets in the first place. But at the same time, it would arguably make it easier for musicians to perform for the screen, especially if they weren't comfortable improvising. But because you actually live in the future and you know how this all ends, it was only a matter of time before someone had the bright idea to specifically synchronize an entire score for a film, taking all of these scoring techniques and putting them together. All of the ideas behind a cue sheet, along with merging original music and pre-existing popular music and classical music and weaving a tapestry of synchronized sound to go with specific scenes on screen at specific times, and that film was Birth of a Nation. I really looked, but it looks like this is the first one to do it. Now, Birth of a Nation was a film written in 1915, and it's a really big deal in film school. I'm not going to pretend to understand why it's such a big deal from a film studies perspective. I'll leave that to the film scholars like Kyle Kalgren and his show Brows Held High. I'll link to his video in the description below. But Birth of a Nation is extraordinarily racist. It features white men in blackface, and the Ku Klux Klan are featured as the heroes of the movie. It's bad. Nowadays, it's really disturbing to see, and the music is no exception to the message that this film is trying to convey. Like, you get Dixie, the national anthem of the Confederacy during the Civil War, playing when the Confederate Army comes marching through. You also get to hear some Turkey in the Straw right here. You probably know this tune by some other name, just don't look up what it was originally called. And of course you get some Wagner, but not only do you get Wagner, you get the Ride of the Valkyries right when the KKK come riding into town. And from the small amount of this film that I've scanned through, it looks like Braille, the original composer for this film, did actually take the time to write individual leitmotifs for characters. But speaking as a guy who loves film scores, you kind of wish that you could just stop there, but it would be irresponsible to just ignore everything else that went into this film. You really can't ignore how racist this film is, and that Wagner was an open anti-Semite, and that his writings would have emboldened the kind of people that made this kind of film. It's really sad, because in many ways, this is the origin of the film soundtrack. This is, in many ways, the first film score ever put to paper. But between Wagner's ideas and the dumpster fire of a story that this film tries to tell, it's really difficult to appreciate this film as the foundation for all film scores that we know today. Like, Rapé's Encyclopedia of Music for Pictures came out almost a decade after Birth of a Nation, and when you look through it, on top of all the classical pieces in there, you can also find what I think is some photoplay music as well. Like, you can see some Zamecnik right here on the first few pages, right next to what I think is Rapé giving himself a shout out. I could be wrong. But you also see Rapé include some of Briel's work in there as well, and it's tough to imagine that at least some of the music from Birth of a Nation didn't find its way into collections like these. It's kind of ominous to think about it, but I imagine that someone somewhere must have added some of that music to this empty space right here. But a few years later, in 1927, that all ended with the invention of the Vitaphone system, and the first ever talkie, or film with synchronized sound, the jazz singer.
Wonderful pals are always hard to find. Some folks have one, some folks have none.
With a phonograph that synchronized with a film on screen, almost overnight, automatic synchronized sound became an industry standard in film. Those films that didn't have synchronized sound then retroactively became known as silent films, and the rest is history. And in the course of just a few short years, the practice of improvising and performing for films, or the entire practice of photoplay, basically became obsolete. Almost overnight, an entire art form faded into obscurity, which is really unfortunate because at the time, movie theaters were the biggest employers of musicians, and because the first talkies came out during the Great Depression, fashion, a massive number of musicians lost their jobs during the most economically brutal time in American history. But the legacy lives on. Nowadays you hear stories of musicians taking silent films back to the stage and performing live music from the same cue sheets and libraries that musicians back in the day would have had to use. I'll leave some videos about that in the description below. And on top of some musicians revitalizing the live performance of this music, some contemporary film composers are working on rescoring old films. You can even find a contemporary score for Buster Keaton's The General that was written by Joe Hisaishi. If that name sounds familiar, that's because he's the composer for all of Hayao Miyazaki's works from Studio Ghibli. So the next time you're sitting down and trying to figure out why a piece of music from a film sounds a certain way, or why we tend to use certain instruments and sounds for certain types of scenes, or for whatever reason you just want to know what might be a good way to score a scene with a blacksmith, then it might be worth going back into the silent film era and seeing if there is someone that recommended using a specific piece of music. Even though it's often overlooked, the era of silent film served as a lens to focus the history of classical music into the realm of the film score. And if it taught us nothing else, it showed us that when all else fails, you can't go wrong with a little bit of ragtime. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons for making these videos possible. The very special thank you to AFN Matt, Andrew Luke, Billy Vasquez, Clara Tan, Dr. Woe, Donovan Hodges, Hayden Elza, Jordan Adams, Karen Rosenau, Who Am I, and Zolbu Tumendembrel. I'd like to thank everybody who requested that I do this kind of video, whether it be like music history or silent films. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. If you'd like to request a video, be sure to check out my Patreon page. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch to have your musical questions answered live. And if you really like what I'm doing, then consider supporting the channel on Patreon. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching.